Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to see all of you here today on this very rainy day in Geneva. Thank you for coming. I believe we have about 140 people also joining us online, so thank you also for being with us. Today we are tackling the 46th Geneva security debate, and we're going to be talking about the rising influence of middle powers in a fragmented world. Let me now tell you that, as you have seen, many international people from International Geneva are here, and this is why we have set up these Geneva security debates, because we really want to provide new insights and new ideas to better understand today's global challenges. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Christina Shori-Liang. I'm head of the counterterrorism and PVE work here at the GCSP, and I'm also an adjunct faculty member at Sciences Po Paris. Let me now introduce the speakers. Let me begin with the ones who are here already. Let me begin with Daniel Lutfi. He is the first secretary and legal advisor at the Permanent Mission of Canada in Geneva. In his role, Daniel supports Canadian teams across a wide range of UN institutions, having been actively involved in negotiations at the Human Rights Council, the Pandemic Agreement, the International Conference of the Red Cross and Red Crescent, and on many other diverse issues. Previously, Daniel worked extensively in South Asia, including a posting in Bangladesh, and has served as a policy advisor on international security matters, as well as legal counsel on various trade agreements. Many of you already know, but Dr. Thomas Greminger is the executive director of the Geneva Center for Security Policy. As senior Swiss diplomat, he has held leadership roles within and outside the federal administration, focusing on security, peace, and development. At the GCSP, Ambassador Greminger addresses major international challenges, including the future of European security and its institutional architecture, the situation in Ukraine, great power relations, emerging technologies, and the evolving concept of Swiss neutrality. As director of the GCSP, he is focused on strengthening the center as a platform, especially for dialogue and conflict resolution, but also for research and policy advice. Previously, Ambassador Greminger served as Secretary General of the OSCE from 2017 to 2020, managing crises in an extremely polarized environment. He supported chairmanships and promoting dialogue among its 57 participating nations. Ambassador Greminger has also written a paper on the agency of middle powers in a fragmented and polarized world. And the paper is available to you outside on the tables, but also for those of you online on the web page of our event. Steve Kalea is also going to join us shortly. He flew in from Oslo and he got caught up in this bad weather. But let me just already introduce him so that when he does arrive, we can launch right into the event. So Steve Kalelia is an accomplished entrepreneur in high technology business development and at the forefront of philanthropic focused activities. He focuses on development and peace. He has always had a strong passion for sustainable development, and in 2000, he created the Charitable Foundation, which specializes in working with the poorest communities of the world. The Charitable Foundation is one of the largest private overseas aid organizations in Australia, and it aims to provide life-changing interventions, reaching as many people as possible. It's really focused on the poor of the poor, the poorest of the poor, active in East and Central Africa and parts of Asia, and it has over 3 million direct beneficiaries. In 2007, Kalelia founded the Institute for Economics and Peace. It's an international think tank dedicated to building a greater understanding of the interconnection between peace and economics, with a particular emphasis on the economics of peace. the Institute for Economics and Peace is the author of 3 very important research papers that come out annually. The first one is the Global Peace Index, which is the world's largest leading measure of peacefulness, and the Global Terrorism Index, which is also read very widely. And finally, its new creation, the Ecological Threat Report, which was recently launched here at the GCSP. So I have introduced all my panelists. One is still on his way. I'm going to just tell you a little bit about the debate. So first of all, we're going to talk about, in part 1, understanding the great fragmentation. And then we're going to follow up with how middle powers exercise influence. And then finally, we'll talk about constructive multipolarity. So back to you, Ambassador Graminger. How do you see the world as it is today, and especially understanding the great fragmentation? Are we living in a very volatile, fragmented world? And how do you see us moving forward?
Well, thanks a lot for joining us for this Geneva security debate. Well, I think, this fragmentation is not a phenomenon that is extremely new, but I think we are more sensitized about this fragmentation, and then also, this sphere of influence policies by great powers. This is not something new, but I think they have become recently just more visible, and I think also when you look at the 3 hegemons, at least in this part of the world, we started from the assumption that we have a rather benevolent hegemon, and while the other 2, depending on where you stood, you would consider them slightly less benevolent. But what we are now seeing is that actually all 3 hegemons have predatory behaviors, and I think that kind of seems to create almost a kind of solidarity among all those that are in between. And in that sense, I think all non-hegemons are in a way in between. I will later then argue that this is not enough, to kind of have a concept of middle powers that is tangible enough, that makes sense also in operational terms. It's more than just sitting in between the 3 hegemons. But I think we have now this sensitivity that we are all in a way in between. More specifically, in between states, it's a term that is not very nice, but many of us that have been dealing with European security are very familiar with that concept, and this for many years. It is a notion that was applied to those states that happen to be in between basically NATO and the Russian Federation. And I think for many years there was an awareness that this is one of the most relevant, latent lines of conflict that we would have in European security. And there were attempts, but none of them very successful, to deal with these in-between states in a creative way. I mean, for those that are not so familiar with the term, it's basically, it's Ukraine, it's Georgia, it's Armenia, it's Azerbaijan, it's Moldova, and to an extent, Belarus. In 2014, had this, what we then called the crisis in and around Ukraine. We, were quickly aware that similar challenges were faced by other in-between countries. And I still recall when we Swiss felt that we had successfully managed, the first tensions in 2014, we then tried to approach the root causes, kind of these tensions, and it was very difficult already back then to talk about these root causes on a track one level. So we tasked a group of eminent experts under the leadership of Wolfgang Ischinger to look into the matter. And he then came up with a report that was entitled Back to Diplomacy. And one of the key recommendations of that very report was to deal diplomatically with the dilemmas these in-between states face. So in that sense, these in-betweens, that's not a new phenomenon, but I think today we are just much more sensitized to this in-between status, because we have hegemons that behave, let me put it diplomatically, in a less benevolent way than they would have in the past.
I will now pass the floor to Steve Kalilia, who will now present the findings from the Institute for Economics and Peace report on the great fragmentation, the rise of middle powers in a fractured international order. He has prepared a short PowerPoint presentation, and the clicker is right there for you as well.
All right, great. Look, I apologise for being late, but I flew in from Oslo this morning. So we produced this paper on the rise of middle-level power. So I'm giving 4 these types of presentations at the moment. So I did the first one in London in the House of Lords, then was up to Belfast, Queen's University, and over in Oslo with Preo yesterday. The aim is really to try and gather information on what the agenda's going to be for a lot of these powers which are rising. So what I've got is a very short presentation, take about 10 minutes, and it'll just give some background on what we're doing. So thank you. So if we start to look initially, what we find is 3 different phases which we've been through since the Cold War. Obviously, after the end of the Second World War. So the first is the Cold War. The second we call sort of a rapid globalisation. That saw really a great rise in human wealth globally and in living standards. That's now past, and we think that the great fragmentation started to occur in about 1991. So that's, 2008. And that really corresponds with the global financial crisis. And whether it's coincidence or whether the rapid increase of capital into the global markets did have some effect on that, at this stage we really don't know. Now, if we're looking at it, you'd see, and we're looking at geopolitical risk. We think it's the highest level since the end of the Cold War. And so basically you're seeing really heightened military spending. In fact, if we looked at the average spending on GDP of countries on their military, more countries have been decreasing it than increasing it up till about 3 years ago. And since then, it's rapidly exploded. A lot of it out of Europe, but also up through Asia with the rise of Chinese assertiveness as well. We obviously can all see the diminished international institutions, but there's a tripling of trade restrictions. Now, even if Trump went away, we'd still have an environment where the trade barriers would still keep on increasing because they were there and increasing before Trump. And we see also increasing level of competition between the great and middle powers, which is something which I'll come back to. What we'd also see, and we can start to see it now, it's really accelerated really since we released this report, but we can see that the dollar is the dominant currency globally, and the trust in the US dollar is slipping, and slipping quickly. And so if we went back, we used to be about 72 cents. And over the last 20 years, that's dropped down to 62% of the foreign reserves. So if we come back and we start to look at material capacity, and it's measured by population, industrial output, energy consumption and military resources. So a lot of these rising middle-level powers have more than a lot of the great powers, which we'll come to soon. In terms of economic power and geopolitical influence, the middle powers are closing the gap with the great powers, and that's of particular relevance, and we'll hit that in about 2 slides for Europe. The rise of the economic power doesn't necessarily equate with military capabilities either. So some of them, such as Israel or Turkey or the UAE, have increased their military capacity quite greatly. But if we look at a lot of other ones, not necessarily so. Now, if we're looking at the great powers, they still have much more military power than any of the rising powers. So in many ways, as the industrial bases hollow out in those great powers, what we're finding is what's left is still a very, very strong, it's very strong military. And so I think as we're moving forward, these middle-level powers we're going to have to watch closely, because they will be exerting more and more control, and they'll change the dynamics of the international situation quite clearly. And we'll find that the power dynamics will become really more complex. It'll affect everything from institutions, which we're already seeing, to the way aid's delivered, and we can see that, and to conflict and much more. As emerging powers combine, it's more, and there's also a concept of emerging powers. So more of them become into middle powers. That's just going to make it much, much harder to actually, for either the superpowers to really control. And so in this world, we're going to find that a lot of the rising middle-level powers and the emerging powers aren't really going to pick sides. They're not going to be aligned, let's say, with the US, China, or necessarily Europe. And the relationships will form around many, many other areas. So just to give you an idea, this is a list of the great powers, and it'll give you an idea where they're at. So if we look at the debt, so we can see they're all above 2.5 trillion. That was one of the measures of cutoff. But you also see that all of them, other than possibly Germany and India and Russia, have really quite sizable debt. If we look at the GDP growth rates for 2025, other than India, you'd have to say that they're very, very small. And when we're looking at the total female reproduction rates, other than India, they're all below replacement rates. So if you're looking at Russia, for example, 140 million people, if you look at the rate of the number of boys being born, it's slightly more than the number of people are getting killed in the battlefield. So the future for Russia with those kind of statistics is quite bleak. If we come down here now, there are 2 types of middle-level powers. One's the established ones. They're the ones which were around prior to 1991, and then the rising ones. So it's a list of them here. Now, one of the things that's really key is not to get caught up in the debate on what is a middle-level power. So we've got a methodology which we do to determine it. Change the methodology and you'll change the powers. The key thing is the changing dynamics and the more influence that these rising middle-level powers and emerging powers are going to have on the international stage. So rather than the definitions, but if we look at the established middle-level powers and just look at the bottom line, if we look at their GDP growth, that averages about 1.65 in 2025. The reproduction rate about 1.3. So we go down and look at the rising middle-level powers. The GDP growth rate's about 50% higher, and the reproduction rate is about 25% higher. So again, that gives some impetus where the actual momentum's moving into the future. Now, the 2 groups we've got here, they behave really differently. So the established powers generally align with the US and with European voting, let's say within the UN and other places. We find that the rising powers are very, very much more independent. Most generally not taking a position with either the US or China and trying to navigate their own path between the two. And we'll see more and more, I think, as we move forward. Now, if you're looking at the two great powers as well, what we find is that we believe that they've hit a zenith of their influence. It's not that they're not going to be really influential in the future, but we see it plateau from about 2015. There's a number of reasons for that. Won't go into it at this stage, but these are other what we call emerging powers. A number of these have the possibility to be able to moving into the category of what we define as middle-level powers. Now, just to drive home this great fragmentation and the effect, this graph gives an idea of the changes in the percentage of global GDP of the great powers from 1995 to 2023. So you'll note Germany is the share is halved. Japanese share is down to about 25%. France is down by about 40%. Britain's down by a similar sort of percentage as well, and Italy's down by about 40% too. So now, although India is the only one which has really increased, Russia's an abnormality because in 1995 it was just coming out of the back end of the breakup of the USSR. So this is an issue for competitiveness and for Europe and the great powers. If they really want to have influence going forward globally, then they're going to have to increase their share of global GDP and have to actually increase the competitiveness of the nations. Now, the number of interstate conflicts has gone up. It's more than tripled in the last decade. And again, that comes back to part of this great fragmentation and the rise of some of these middle-level powers, in particular UAE, Turkey, and Israel. And also, in the Global Peace Index, we've got the neighbouring countries' relationships. That's dropped 13% in the last 15 years. And as I was mentioning, European productivity's flat. Same thing for Australia as well. So really, this raises more questions than it answers about the future international system. So what new alliances are going to form and a lot of this will rise out of values, and the values is a very debatable thing, but the values of these countries are quite different than the values of the people, mainly the West, which has set the international system over the last 50 years. So I think one of the things is understanding how these countries are going to operate. I guess this means a lot for Europe, and it's Europe's ability to be able to exercise influence going forward as well, particularly with its global competitiveness waning. And the alliances which will form, how will they shape and affect the international systems? So these questions we haven't got answers to, and these sessions I'm doing as I'm running around the world are really trying to get a better idea of where all this may be going. And the Great Fragmentation, it's a series of reports we'll be producing over the next couple of years, and part of the exercise at the moment is to find out what the next one should be, and I've got a pretty good idea, but I'll stop there. And so thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Steve, for that excellent introduction to your paper. We will now go forward with the debate. It is structured in 3 parts. We're first going to focus on understanding the Great Fragmentation, and then how middle powers exercise influence, and finally, constructive multipolarity. We'll try to find some solutions for that. So as Steve has highlighted and the report has really underscored, is that we are in a 3rd major geopolitical phase, the Great Fragmentation. And as you also highlighted, global peacefulness is deteriorated in 13 of the last 17 years. And what also struck me from the report is that military spending has reached a record 2.7 trillion in 2024. So the risk now is larger than was documented during the Cold War. So My first set of questions will focus on the fragmentation part, so understanding the great fragmentation. So back to you, Steve. You're really in the center here. So based on your research, how is the US-China-Russia rivalry structurally reshaping the international system and expanding middle power agency?
So I guess I'll come back to sort of both Russia and China. We think at the peak of their influence. It's not they're going to go away. It's just going to have more players rising. So looking at the US, I don't really need to talk about that too much because it's right through the news. Bigger question would be, will Trump survive? And what we're seeing, this rapid change at the moment, whether the pace will slow down in the future. So you've got midterm elections coming up in the US. I don't believe the Republicans are really behind Trump's international agenda. Not saying much on it at the moment, but you'd think of the establishment, particularly if you think of the military, you think of the intelligence community, the fracturing with NATO, support for what they'd see as their long-term enemies, such as Russia. They're hardly likely to be on board with Trump's agenda. The elections which they've held recently in the States would show a massive swing against him. So Congress is likely to be against him once you come back. And a lot of his overreach is with functions which really, in the Constitution, lie with Congress. So what we're seeing at the moment may be the peak of a whole lot of change, but that doesn't mean it's not going to stop. If we come back to China, their debt to GDP ratio is estimated to be about 140% at the moment. So that's really, really, really quite sizable. But worse, more impactful than that, when we're looking at it, is the foreign direct investments dropped 95% because of perceived risk in China over the last 3 years. So that's really going to make quite a lot of change. And so as we start to watch this, and also we can see with China, the Belt and Road Initiative, that peaked in about 2015. Not a lot of money going into it at the moment, again, because they need to prop up their domestic economy, which is, at the moment, very, very weak. And it's got one of the lowest female reproduction rates in the world, which means you've got an ageing population and then you've got a lot of things which go with it. Very, very low social services. And so what it means is that people tend to save rather than spend on consumption. And so they've got an issue in actually trying to boost the kind of consumption economies which we're used to in the West. So out of that, what happens when you start to see countries which don't want to actually align either way? What you're doing is you're starting to see a whole range of new alliances forming. And sort of the shape and the nature and the way they go, I haven't really got the answers to it yet because it's in flux. And I'll talk maybe a little bit later on about the systems, the way systems operate, tipping points, and path dependency, but I'll leave that alone at the moment. I think the other thing for this room is the loss of influence of Europe. I think everyone needs to really seriously consider what are the ramifications of that. And it's obviously the EU, it's one of the most powerful groups in the world, but the actual influence is on the decrease. Maybe I've got a lot more I could say, but I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thomas, where do you see the fragmentation placing the most acute pressures on states in between? How are middle powers feeling it?
Yeah, building on what I said before, I think we see these great powers, these hegemons conducting, investing, believing more in these sphere of interest policies. They have policies that are much more transactional, unilateral, bilateral, not believing in multilateral problem solving anymore. There are zero-sum policies that we see. And we see these hegemons pressure all of us to take sides. So basically this notion, either you're with us or you're against us, I think this notion gets stronger and stronger. And, we saw it very recently with the hegemon that we, until recently, considered to be a benevolent hegemon, when 8 European states were not willing to come along with President Trump's ideas on Greenland. They were immediately threatened with tariffs. And I think this seems to be the new normal. If you are not in line with a policy defined by a hegemon, you're going to be immediately threatened, be it by tariffs, be it by other means. And I think this, then begs the question, what do we that are not hegemons do with all of this? And I think that then, brings us to the concept of middle powers, which, by the way, is not a new concept. I think it has been rediscovered and it is being reinvigorated. There are a few countries out there that have been self-identifying with this notion of middle power. Turkey is a case, Kazakhstan are cases. But, as a matter of fact, traditional middle powers were Canada, Australia, etc. But somewhere over the last 10, 15 years, this notion then got lost. And now, thanks to the Canadian Prime Minister, we have all rediscovered this concept. And, since earlier in my career, I had excellent experiences in cooperating with Canada, Canada acting, in a middle power way. I was very happy about that rediscovery of a concept that I find very useful, not least now, to get organized and to, and I totally agree with Steve. I think it's less important to have a very precise definition of what a middle power is. But I think what is really exciting is to see, how they can team up, how they can form new alliances, and to produce global commons, to build bridges, etc., etc.
Thank you so much. And I think Prime Minister Carney gave us all a lot of hope in Davos with his speech. So over to you as a Canadian diplomat, Mr. Daniel Lutfi. As an established middle power, Canada has been guiding principles in our divided world and divided system. It has always been principled. It has always been a middle power. What have you learned over the years about the opportunities and limits of being a middle power, especially with your new southern neighbor?
Thank you very much, Andrea. And I also thought our Prime Minister gave a great speech. I should say, for those of you who saw the early postings, I am not the ambassador, but I probably would have written his talking points anyways. So hopefully the gap isn't too large. Let me start just by reflecting on a couple things from the presentation that Steve gave and the report. I mean, one, I think it's really interesting that the data shows a plateau in great power status, but in great power influence. But of course, a plateau, where you have a number of rising middle powers can mean more than one thing. It could mean more space for the middle powers, or it could mean that the three great powers hold their power steady, and the middle powers are now splitting up what power and influence they have much more diffusely among a much larger number of states. So you may have greater capacity for influence within middle powers, so to speak, when they can organize, but also a situation where it's actually much harder for middle powers to organize together because within that you have quite a diversity of interests, of values, of approaches to the world. And of course, what's so interesting about the report is really the focus on the new category of middle powers. Canada as an established power, or as a shall we say, historically describe middle power. And I don't know to what extent this is true in other countries, but certainly within Canada, sometimes in a serious way, sometimes in a self-congratulatory way, we've long described and thought of ourselves as a middle power. But what that's meant in practice has meant very different things at different times. If you go back to the immediate post-World War II environment, Canada was quite influential in helping to shape the UN system and the immediate responses of the UN. But of course, that was a very, very different context, right? I think at the end of the Second World War, Canada had the world's 4th largest navy. We're a long way from that now. At the end of the Second World War, the UN had less than 60 countries, I believe, in the General Assembly. So one country had significantly more influence back then. So it was a time when Canada had, I think, influence because of its credibility, but also because of a degree of hard power. If you jump forward to the 70s and 80s, it was a different kind of middle power influence. We no longer had that hardcore of power. Decolonization meant you had a much, much broader, set of voices in the UN. And what middle power influence became in that period was really a functional, niche, expertise-specific influence. It was a period where, when Canada tried to exercise influence, it was usually by identifying topics and areas where we had expertise, where we had interest, where we had the capacity to invest, and building on that, right? It was expertise and niche specific. Now, Thomas spoke very fondly of the sort of the peace dividend moment, and GCSP, of course, is one of the outcomes of that as well. And I think that was an exciting time to be a Canadian diplomat, or so my older colleagues tell me. And it was a time when, again, I think Canada and other countries like it had a lot of influence. Perhaps the paradigmatical example is the Ottawa Convention on anti-personnel landmines, which was significant and had enormous influence on changing the norms around the use of anti-personnel landmines and mobilizing significant financial resources for demining, but of course was never universal. Remains not universal. It didn't establish a principle of customary international law. It had influence, but it also had limits. That was a time when I think the multilateral environment was much more permissive. Thomas and I were discussing this a little bit before, but it was a time when, I think it's pretty clear from the historical record that the US was not particularly keen on the Ottawa Convention, but nor were they sort of so firmly opposed to it that they were going to bring the whole thing down. It was a time when countries like Canada, working with civil society in particular, could do norm entrepreneurship. We're in a different space now. I think those are clearly not the same options and possibilities we have now. But the reason I sort of find some of this history interesting is because when we talk about middle powers now, how they respond to the moment, the way in which even one middle power has been able to exercise influence has not always been the same. And the diversity only increases if you look at, Turkey, which is in many ways within its region much more influential than Canada has been in a regional context, but is maybe less influential on some global issues. Again, Indonesia, I hesitate to describe India as a middle power. They seem much more like a great power to me. But there's no one recipe. I think a question for all of us who work in this space, who think about this space and who are part of middle powers is, where are the opportunities to have influence and what are the vectors where we can have them? And, we have a few ideas, but of course, this isn't an issue where, Canada's going to have the answer, right? The voices of other middle powers are going to be just as not, more important.
Thank you so much. And you've already leaped into our second part in how middle powers exercise influence. But let me go back to you, Ambassador Greminger. How are middle powers likely to reshape their global governance based on their institutions and current values?
Well, I would agree that the political environment is harsher today. It's less permissive. But perhaps we also tend to romanticize a bit the past. I think what hasn't changed is, if you want to, advance multilateral reforms, if you want to build global commons, if you want to act as a peacemaker, I think you need a number of features, and in many of the cases, you need alliances to achieve that. And this, in turn, requires a few features. And I think one feature, and that is quite obvious in the case of Canada, Turkey, Kazakhstan, etc., is material capacity to project power, exert leverage. But then I would argue, you also need this willingness, this political commitment to do so. So you need political leaders that are ready to invest political capital. And I think you need to combine that then with diplomatic tradecraft, with expertise, diplomatic skills. One without the other does not lead to results. And then obviously another feature I think that is quite important, being a middle power means operating in a space where you have the hegemons, okay, powers, you have smaller states. So it's very much relational. And obviously, if you happen to have good relations with key actors for an issue or for a geography, this helps. I mean, Turkey, again, its president, is capable of talking to the presidents of all three hegemons. That's clearly an asset, right? Qatar, has an extremely good relation with Washington. The same is true for Riyadh. I think that is an asset if you want to act. And then perhaps you need to be agile because you are going to engage in different alliances. You're not in a set organization. But at the same time, I would argue, and this is perhaps also relatively novel in the piece that I wrote, I think you also need to have a principled foreign policy. You need to be predictable. You need to be reliable. You need to build a solid reputation over time. And I think this is not compatible with adventurous foreign policies that you see, for instance, in some of the Gulf states that have this ambition of being a middle power. So, yeah, I would say these are some of the biggest features. But just perhaps, you mentioned the Ottawa Convention. The Ottawa Convention was the product of such an alliance. It was the Human Security Network that you created, Canada, together with Norway. A bit later, Switzerland came on board. And at the end, I think you had around 13, 14, perhaps 15 countries, cross-regional, very nice. You had South Africa, Thailand, others were on board. And you had political leaders that believed in it, that pushed it. And by the way, when these leaders were gone, the relevance of the Human Security Network declined rapidly. The network not only produced the Ottawa Convention, it contributed to the cluster ammunition, to soft law on child soldiers. When we Swiss created the UN Human Rights Council, or pushed the initiative that led to the creation of the UN Human Rights Council, we heavily relied on the Human Security Network. So for a few years, this was a very powerful gathering. I could offer you a totally different alliance that you may not think of immediately when you talk about middle powers, and that is the group of neutrals and non-aligned that drove the Helsinki process 54 years ago, that led then to the Helsinki Decalogue. And I think similarly, you had an alliance of countries where you had committed leaders that were ready to take some risks, combined with solid professional diplomacy. and quite some stamina over a longer time period that led then to results.
Thank you so much. I see a book coming out of that on all the history of the importance of middle powers. I'm going to now ask you again, Steve. A future international system will be shaped by new alliances and the values of middle powers. What are these values?
Well, I think that's the $64 question, actually. Quite often there's a lot of the discussion on that the alliance is going to be issue-based in the way they form going forward, and they'll be malleable and they'll shift according to what they see as their short-term interest. I don't necessarily hold to that view. So I think if we're looking at a lot of these middle-level powers coming up, a lot of them have got ancient histories. So like Indonesia, for example, you take its history, it's 600, 700, 800 years of civilization. You look at Turkey, it's the same. You could go to the Middle East, and again, you can go back and you've got these long histories. So if we're looking at it through a theory of the systems, one of the key things for systems is path dependency. And that path dependency describes your future. And if we're looking at it from a European perspective, we can see it clearly in the way the history has shaped us to come up with the principles which we all believe in, which is real-based systems and basically humanitarian systems. So now as we start to understand it, we really understand where these countries are likely to be, we do need to understand their history and their values. So you can see blocs forming, which will be around specific issues. Could be around trade, for example. But as you start to now develop new blocks of trade, those trade relationships will not be issue-based. You'll stick with it because you'll have your dependencies. And you start to build investing capital in other country and building manufacturing plants. You can't move from them quickly. There'll be alliances. Let's say, we look at climate change, for example. That's a long-term issue. And then a lot of countries will buy in that and form relationships around it over the long term. And on the opposite effect, we can see that the oil-producing countries are forming alliances to actually push back on it. So and these, again, long-term relationships, but they're issue-based again. So if you're looking at, let's say, the rise of a number of the Islamic countries, they've got a separate set of values and they've got their belief systems which they'll then start to put into the relationships which they exert overseas. Indonesia, for example, is just recently, they'd been working on it for 7 or 8 years, implemented a form of Sharia law. It's a mild form, but it's basically that comes out of their path dependency as well. As you're looking at systems too, they've got the concept of encoded norms. That's the thing which keeps systems in place. Very hard to change systems because of their encoded norms. And I won't go into detail on what they are, but again, once you create, let's say, your issue-based coalitions, they'll develop these encoded norms which will carry them forward into the future.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So again, back to Davos. Prime Minister Carney described the moment as a rupture, not a transition, cautioning that compliance will not buy safety. How should middle powers interpret this message in terms of strategic autonomy and stabilizing institutional cooperation?
Well, thank you for the question. And I've certainly, I think, probably like many of you, had many questions and discussions about, Mr. Carney's speech. It really, I think, captured a moment. But if I would say one thing about it to start is that I think as a speech, it's mostly diagnosis, not prescription, right? I mean, its power is that it describes a reality that I think when many people heard it, resonated. They said, yes, that is the reality we are seeing. The doctrine that comes from that, the diagnosis, Carney gave some ideas. I'll elaborate on that a little bit, but that was a much thinner part of the speech, right? For I think obvious reasons. It's much harder. You can diagnose the problem. Building out the solutions is a much longer term effort. but on that, sort of, let me speak a little bit about some of the directions that he pointed in. One is, he was very clear that I think we need to move, particularly for a country like Canada, we have to move from a place where our risk mitigation was effectively mostly passive, right? Like, what reduced our risks was the fact that we had a stable neighbor, we had a security umbrella, we had established trade relationships, and we're having to move to a much more, active effort of not assuming those old habits, those old influences and relationships still apply, and figuring out how we can increase our space for options. And so Carney spoke about, he was recently in China. Our foreign minister was recently in India. We've announced a whole raft of new trade agreements, some that are longer term, like the CETA with Europe and CPTPP. I think we're the only G7 country that has free trade agreements with all the other G7 countries. Prime Minister Carney was very clear, on his in terms of his trip to China. We're not negotiating a full free trade agreement with China. What's been agreed is sectoral, in a way that we think is in both of our interests, but in a way that increases some options for Canada. Of course, we can't escape geography or history. We still have I think 3/4 of our exports that go to the US. So we have the longest undefended border with the US. There's no escaping that reality, and I don't think there's any ambition of having a relationship that is decoupled in any way from the US. But what we can do is, where we have space and where we have choices, trying to be deliberate about increasing our options. And part of that is partnered with new partners, but another part of that, I think, is, Carney spoke about essentially, like-minded enough partnerships. We can't have we have to have our values. Canadians expect it of us, and values are also an important part of credibility, which goes to consistency, which Thomas spoke about as one of the important things that builds your influence over time. But at the same time, you can't apply a moral purity test to your relationships with other countries. It's going from, too often, I think, in Canada, the question has been, at least within Canada, should we have a relationship with this country? And it needs to evolve much more to, what kind of relationship are we having with this country? We're going to have our limits, we're going to have our guardrails, but we also need to have partnerships where we can. So, fundamentally, I think it's about shift from passive reliance to much more active risk mitigation. And it's also about being honest with citizens. There are, like with any diversification, there are economic costs to diversification. There is effort that goes in. It's the same as with a portfolio, right? If you have one great investment, you can do better than if you have a multitude of investments, but that's how you reduce your risks. And we also have to be honest and candid with our citizens. Candid that there are trade-offs. Sometimes it's going to mean an economic trade-off, and sometimes it's going to mean a values trade-off. So combining those two things, candidness with our citizens, and a shift from passive to active risk mitigation, I think helps us structure a path forward.
Thank you. And just again, adding a bit to this, your Prime Minister also mentioned that we need to build a stronger and more just system. And he talked about strategic alliances and, like you just mentioned, economic diversification. But he famously suggested that we must build something better. And I know this is a huge question, so forgive me in advance, but how do you envision this to happen? What are the building blocks of this new system, and what can we take from the old and to build the new?
Well, if anyone has a full answer to that, please let me know. That would be wonderful. But look, let me start with an analogy that I think applies to middle powers. Middle powers are we're not going to be, rebuilding the roof, right? We are going to be looking at the different pillars, and maybe Canada says, we've got some timber, we can replace this pillar here, but there's another pillar over there, and we're going to have to hope someone else steps up and repairs that. We can strengthen some of the aspects, find where we have the capacity and the influence, where we think there's structural weakness that we can address, but we're not in a position to rebuild the whole system. What does stronger and more just mean? I think it means in part a system that works better a more diverse, I should say maybe not more diverse, more distributed system. A more distributed system is one that's good for Canada because we have more options, but it should also be a system that's good for, frankly, all non-hegemons because it gives all non-hegemons more options. Look, I mean, building blocks is, I think, going to be a long-term, multi-year effort, but let me just throw a few ideas out there. One, I've already mentioned, so I'll just mention quickly, diversifying the web of our economic relationships. I mean, I think that's a clear one. Canada's doing that. You can see with the EU's recent announcement of a trade agreement with India, also trying to do that. Many countries trying to do that in different ways. I think countries also can play a useful role on norms. And let me give an example on that. A few years ago, it became evident to Canada that arbitrary detention was a really tangible and direct security risk for Canada. Canada wasn't the only country that had experienced cases of Canadian citizens being arrested and effectively used as leverage for geopolitics. But we had a particularly high-profile example. Canada's responses to this was to develop what's been called the Arbitrary Detention Initiative, which now has 80 countries that have signed up to this. What has been the effect of the Arbitrary Detention Initiative? I think the effect has been a little bit like Carney's speech, actually. It's helped name an issue. It's helped set some baseline norms around what's acceptable. Is it going to stop great powers from doing that when they want to? No. But will it raise the costs? Will it make it slightly harder for them to do it? We think it is having some of that impact. And I think that normative role is something that middle powers can still do and can still play. And the other one, and of course, this is very issue specific when it's going to be possible, but is collective action, right? I mean, we've seen at times the EU be able to come together. There was a negotiation on the margins of Davos that we all heard about, where it seems from at least the media reporting we've read that the EU's ability to sort of present a common front had a tangible outcome. And that remains the case. It's not easy to organize, but collective action and working on norms, there are no hard walls we can build, but there are, if you think of there are speed bumps we can build, right, that make it harder for great powers to exercise coercion without any limits.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to now ask also you, Thomas, what do you think are the building blocks of this new global order?
I think it's important, to kind of start with looking at what, is still valid, what is still useful in this old order, even though, there is this notion that the rules-based international order is dead, and the old order is gone, and I think the vast majority of states, they still believe in international law, right? And I think that's something we should build on. The vast majority of states still believe that global challenges need international responses where everybody has to chip in order to get to an answer. I think there is also a vast majority of states realizing that the planet is closing in on us. So, we have no choice then to deal with a few global challenges, and we can only do that in cooperation, climate change, dealing with, the risks, and also the benefits of emerging technologies, the pandemics, etc. And I think on this we can build. But then, coming back to the discussion before, we see that, countries, actors that played a much more active role in supporting this system, they're pulling out, they're pursuing their own transactional policies. And this then begs the question, what do we others with this situation? And I think that's where, then politicians like Prime Minister Carney says, well, there is agency by this group of countries called middle powers. And small parenthesis, middle powers would also include states that identify with being a small state, but basically having the characteristics of middle power policies. I would include my own country in that, Switzerland, all along, by the way, with Singapore or Qatar. Qatar identifies with being a small state, but it does so because their neighbors identify with being a middle power. But if you look at their policies, it's very much, the kind of policies that I would associate with middle power policy. So, I mean, to come back and look ahead, I think this agency implies that these states have a role in contributing to producing global commons, in reforming the multilateral system, acting as an economic connector. Some of these middle powers, have started playing a very active role as peace mediators, facilitators. I think there are a range of domains where, their agency is required.
Thank you so much. We're now moving to our third and final part, constructive multipolarity. And Steve, I wanted to ask you whether or not your research helps us to understand what are more realistic pathways to a constructive multipolarity over the next decade.
That's one of the parts of the research is that what is that? It's pretty hard to really sit here and exactly see it, but we can also look at it from a few different lenses. And I think when we don't want to be too pessimistic about the international rules-based system as we know it falling away and disappearing. What would say is it's shaky is probably the way I'd see it, and it is fragmenting, and certainly as you've got a fragmenting, but it's still needed, and the UN is not going to disappear, maybe much weakened, but it's certainly not going to disappear. But if we're looking at sort of realistic pathways for constructive multipolarity, so that one of the things which all countries want is stronger economic growth, and particularly the middle level powers. So the thing which is most destructive on growth is conflict. So and although the world's moving in the opposite direction, which all our research shows, I still think that the economic argument for peace, for middle level powers, is powerful. And so when we're using the middle level powers, and we put in the emerging powers as well. And so when they're in a peaceful and consistent environment, they're likely to get higher GDP growths. And a lot of time, that's really what a lot of them are really trying to seek. Now, if we're looking at it and sort of we're looking at all these various new alliances which are likely to form, the thing for them to really be work and to work successfully, they need to be inclusive and they need to be stable. So how do we sort of, as these new alliances and new relationships form, whether they're trading relationships, technological relationships, or cultural relationships, how do they become sort of inclusive and rules-based and to give the stability needed? Now, one of the other ways is like we've got GDP growth globally is falling for a whole range of different reasons. So how do you actually get to stability such that you now get a line so you can now look at how do you actually really increase a global GDP growth? And that can be done independent of China and independent of the US and the kind of trade relationships which we're starting to see and form as part of it. But if we're looking at productivity, and I'll keep coming back to it because it's something people don't pay much attention to, it's very hard to actually improve the lives of the citizens in your country if your productivity is flat or falling. And without that, then there's obviously going to be a whole lot of fracturing within the country, and you're going to find that people are getting disillusioned with the political system. That's just not true for what we can see, let's say, in Western countries. That's just as true in Indonesia as it is in Kenya, as it is in Nigeria.
And I now want to open the floor to questions, because I think a lot of you have come so far for this event and also in the rain. So who would like to begin?
My first question is on the overall topic. Isn't it a good news for the world that the middle powers are rising in influence? Instead of having a world with more democracies, want a more democratic world for good balance of power. I have another small question for Steve. I think you mentioned about the US midterm elections coming later this year. And I totally align with your prediction that probably Trump's party may lose out on Congress. Will that lead to a more lame duck type of Trump in the rest 2 years of his presidency? Maybe the rantings will continue, but effectiveness may go down. What is your comment?
It's very hard to crystal ball the future, particularly in the US, but I would have thought that Trump will have a whole lot of pushback going forward, just not from the Democrats, but from a whole different levels of areas within the Republican Party and within the establishment at the moment. So what he's done is he's driven really, really fast forward. Okay? And in driving fast forward, he's broken a lot of the laws of the country in doing it. Now, the legal system's always slow. Over time, all that will catch up with him unless he can get control of the legal system. Now, at the moment, he's trying to set himself up so he has control, and he'll try in some shape, way or form to disrupt the midterm elections. No doubt about that at all, okay? But at the moment, he's trying to get the lists of a national list of all voters so they can scrub the voters who shouldn't be voting. Now, he's not going to get there in that, because in the Constitution, control of the voting is the responsibility of the states or the local electorates. So this kind of things get hard. Now, you may have a Supreme Court which is conservative, but they are under the rule of law. And even though they'll go quite conservative, they're unlikely to break the Constitution in any major radical way. So I think a lot of ways those legal things will catch up with him. I think a lot of the establishment, I've mentioned earlier on, I think if you're looking at the military, you're looking at the intelligence services, they'd be aghast with him trying to pull NATO apart and destroying the alliances in Europe. And from a strategic perspective, the idea of talking about taking over Greenland, or Canada for that effect, it's ridiculous. Now, in my mind, the thing to really watch is what's going to happen with the US dollar. Mm-hmm. So we've seen the rush in the gold price over the last couple of years. A lot of that's because the national reserves now, countries are now investing their national reserves in gold rather than US dollars. So if we're looking at just the depreciation of the US dollar, you can see that appreciating over recent time. So we're coming back and you want to look at the BRICS, for example, and they're not necessarily that cohesive, but they have built the New Development Bank, and they're looking now at how can they get 30% of the trade they do denominated in currencies other than US dollar. So now, if you think about most countries of the IMF and World Bank, their debt's denominated in US dollars. So now you get a depreciating US currency with increasing interest rates. That's really bad for the states. Do you think the financial community is going to back Trump through all that? But just in terms of this fragmentation, if you think so you're Nigeria, Okay, you've got your debt 80% of GDP, with most of it with the IMF, World Bank denominated in US dollars. So the US currency comes down. That's great. Your debt goes down, but as the US interest rates go up, so do your interest rate payments. What's the effect of all this when you multiply it out over the world? So on terms of the fragmentation of the global international financial system.
Thank you so much. We had another question right here, but you wanted to add to that too.
But I think, we may have less predatory behavior after the midterms, but there remains a large predictability gap when it comes to, who will dominate US foreign policy in the future. Is it the US primacists? Is it the isolationists? Is it the prioritizers? I think it's very difficult to tell right now. And I think what does that mean for us? I think, we should, act on the agency and try to improve our agency to be less dependent, on the whims of what comes out of Washington, D.C. And I think this is particularly true when we look at European security. I think this lesson we should have learned by now, that there needs to be more autonomy. And I think, this reluctance in really believing in multilateral problem solving, I'm not so sure that this is something that we will have to live with for quite some years to come. And so I think, if we want to reinvigorate multilateral institutions, I think, we better get our act together.
Thank you so much. And please go ahead.
Okay. The non-aligned movement has many middle or possible middle powers. I've noticed over the years that the non-aligned movement has increased in importance, and I read the communique from the last conference of the non-aligned in Uganda, I think 2 years ago. Very detailed, very long, very ambitious. But one of the things I noticed was the links to the regional organisations, ASEAN, the BRICS, the AU, the African Union. Do you think that as the UN is now losing credibility and power, and we notice it's become quite weak in many respects, that these regional organisations with the non-aligned movement are going gradually to take over? And it's also linked to the currency issue, because I think the BRICS were looking at trying to move away from the American dollar. Is this the future? Do you think this is going to be the future?
Thank you so much. And I'm going to add, because we had a question online that is very similar. So the person asked about the positionality of the middle powers towards the US and China. How can something like the non-aligned movement be put forth, considering US has the dollar and tariff advantage, whilst China has the trade surplus and critical manufacturing advantage? So just to add on.
So it's a difficult question to understand where it's all going to go. And that's why I'm going around the world talking to try and get a better sense and feel for it. So look, so we look at the different regional blocs. If you're going to see groups now wanting to get less aligned with the US, less aligned with China, but they still want to trade with them, and with the US they still want to buy their military equipment. And they use their AI and their high tech. So it's the balance. So regional blocks, I think, will probably increase more in cohesiveness would probably be the word I'd use. I think we'll see a whole lot of other things prop up we can't even think about at the moment. Changes in the US dominance is going to be hard to shift. So if you think about the international monetary system, okay, so all your credit cards, your SWIFT system, they're all controlled by the US, all your international payment systems. If we look today, I think we're looking at trade, you've got 20% of it's done in euro, you've got about 3% in the renminbi, and the rest pretty much all US dollars. You look at the New Development Bank, which is coming up out of the BRICS, and some mentioned earlier on, they want to get 30% of their trade denominated in their dollars. But you've got China and you've got India in there. They're never going along. They've got a 1,000-kilometre border, which they dispute. And then again, this is back to systems and path dependency. They've historically been in competition for thousands of years. So it's sort of got limited agency. That would be my take on that in the long run. Looking at the AU, so the AU in many ways, as you can see that forming and getting more and more cohesive. It's got very strong principles about not interfering in other countries, although we can see Rwanda and we can see the DRC and what's going on there. We can watch Ethiopia into Somalia and other places as well. But they are trying to sort of develop their own mechanisms. Part of the AU, which they're very strong on, we've done research for them and contract research for them on this, is looking at transitions, and that's the likelihood of coups, because one of the things that they're very strong on is not creating coups in other countries. So look, how it all goes, I don't know. Actually, I think these two gentlemen have probably got a better answer for it than me, but that was long-winded.
Thank you.
Well, I would say, the non-aligned movement is dead. But we have, and also in the sense that the non-aligned movement came along with a lot of ideology. Yeah? There was also a sense of having joint values, etc. I think that is gone. What we have today is, and by the way, many countries, wouldn't want to be associated with being non-aligned. Ask Indians, for instance, they tell you, we are multi-aligned, which is a totally different concept. It's much more interest-driven. And so I think this then leads to unilateral structures, clubs, interest-driven, and you see it all over. I mean, over the last 10, 15 years, you have seen a rise of unilateral structures. It's incredible. And I think that's not per se bad. There is obviously a but to it if it comes at the explicit expense of inclusive multilateral institutions. It becomes a problem over time, because there are some issues that you can only address successfully in an inclusive setting. And if you bet exclusively on minilateral clubs, you obviously undermine in the long term these multilateral structures. But it's not per se bad, these minilateral. At times, it's just a kind of a club of the willing that is ready to move ahead in, for instance, implementing relevant measures to adapt to climate change at a much higher pace than others. Well, let them do that, right? But let's make sure that the club remains open-ended, so others can join, and let's still preserve inclusive bodies. Regional organizations, I think that has been the trend to say, yes, global bodies are overburdened, they're weakened, so let's bet on regional organizations. Again, per se, an excellent idea, and in some settings it works, and you have seen really efficient and effective regional mechanisms. But often, these regional bodies, they incorporate either global divides, clearly in Europe, OEC is a case in point, or they have important regional divides that then make them, to an extent, dysfunctional or fully dysfunctional. Again, I could give you half a dozen examples quickly. So again, regional bodies is not the panacea.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry, we're running out of time.
Yeah.
Did you want to add one last word?
I'll just come in quickly to say, one, minilaterals, are definitely one of the paths of the future. It's a way of solving problems pragmatically. There's also a cost. There's an efficiency cost at some point when we're managing 10 or 12 minilaterals, we start to say, boy, the UN doesn't look so inefficient anymore, right? Because each one of these is a lot of work to mobilize and organize. And when it comes to groupings, it's again, this is a trite answer, but it just depends on the issue. I mean, and there are these path dependencies, even in really boring functional ways, right? At the Human Rights Council, the non-aligned movement sometimes still negotiates as a bloc. That has a power. It also means, if you talk to non-aligned movement diplomats, they'll tell you it's so hard to reach agreement before we get to the actual negotiation that we can no longer negotiate with you once we get into the room because we've done all our negotiating within the bloc. And it depends on the issue. I mean, if you look at the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, right? I don't think anyone would say that was an equitable global response. If you want to have a more equitable response in the future, you can't negotiate that within Africa. That's not where the inequity was, right? You have to negotiate it, in a multilateral environment where you have, the groupings that were on either side of that debate.
Okay, thank you. So I would like to thank all of you. As we have discussed, the global order is entering a period of profound disruption. Established rules and long-standing alliances and multilateral institutions are no longer taken for granted, but we have hopefully proven to you that middle powers are now in a very unique position to stabilize, shape, and form this new international order. So I would like to thank our panelists. Let's give them a big I also would like to thank everyone behind the scenes, Hajer Abid, Laura Albas, Florian Gollet, and Anne Prosser, who I hopefully is online, and Nuriam Zenijbek. Thank you so much for helping. We're going to have another Geneva security debate on the 11th of March, and we're going to look at Europe's economy and how it's under threat by the US and China. We are going to do this with the Switzerland-Asia's group. So we're delighted, but thank you so much for coming from so far. Australia, I think you're the farthest that anyone has ever come to on our Geneva security debate. And thank you all for your wonderful questions. Wow. And I look forward to all seeing you on the 11th for our next edition. Thank you.